Emily, why don't you set up for us this really interesting polling from NBC News about some Republican priorities?
This stuff is fascinating. I'm so glad that we can actually put this up on the screen, the first element in the B block. So B1 here. Look at that. I know that the font is kind of small there, so I'm going to break it out for everyone. This is an NBC News poll that tested 11 different proposals and issues that the GOP candidates are campaigning on. And basically, they say, that I'm reading from the report, the recent push on using the military at the border is resonating with general election voters, though they, Republicans, are down on several other high-profile policy planks. So if you're looking at the screen, you're going to want to look at the upper left there. So support for deploying the U.S. military to the Mexican border to stop illegal drugs from entering the country. That said, so 55% of people say that would make them more likely to vote for a presidential candidate. Then take your eyes all the way down to the bottom right. Wants to address the federal budget deficit by reducing Social Security and Medicare benefits for those who are not already enrolled in these programs. Only 12% of people said that would make them more likely to vote for a candidate. 77% of people say that would make them less likely to vote for a candidate. The most popular position that they tested among all registered voters and Republican primary voters was deploying the military to the Mexican border. And notice it wasn't just deploying the military. They asked in the question specifically about stopping illegal drugs from entering the country. And that's actually a pretty key distinction, because we talked yesterday about the Stephen Miller drone the migrant boat allegation, which both of us, I think, find a little bit dubious. But the distinction there is we're just going to stop people from entering the country, not drugs.
Right.
And when you're asking specifically about drugs, that should be a huge red flag for Republicans to test out that messaging if they want this, like, deploy the military to the border thing to work electorally. You probably want to ask specifically about stopping the flow of drugs. That's what's polling well, and that is a very different thing than people. Drugs, people, very different. You think that sounds pretty obvious, but to politicians, it's not.
Yeah, and they actually tested also. So they tested supports deploying troops to the border to stop illegal drugs, and that was the best. This is, a whole list of basically Republican priorities. There's a bunch of stuff about, transgender kids. There's stuff about abortion. There's stuff about stop the steal. So they tested all of these sort of like Republican talking points and priorities. And so they tested deploy the troops for illegal drugs, and they tested deploy the troops for immigration. And that did poll significantly less well. It still was among the better polling of the GOP priorities, but it was less effective than stopping illegal drugs with troops. And I think it's a sign of, we're still in, it just keeps getting worse and worse. We had a fair amount of attention during the 2016 campaign about how bad the addiction crisis had gotten, how bad the opioid addiction crisis had gotten, how many overdose deaths, and just what a scourge of America this was. And some of that attention has fallen off, even as the numbers have continued to grow and have really gotten worse and worse. So I think it reflects what continues to be a horrific human toll and pain point with the American public. Even as we discussed yesterday, I think this solution is not the right one. Really, I think the only solution is to legalize, tax, and regulate, and end the war on drugs, because we've been doing this forever, and our addiction rates just keep on getting worse and worse. But I do think it just reflects that human pain that people are still going through. It's interesting, if you go down the list here, some of the places where there's a real divergence between how the public feels about the issue and how just the Republican base feels about the issue. Abortion is one of the top ones in terms of that sort of like disconnect. So overall, you only have 29% who say that banning abortion after the first 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is the Ron DeSantis, that's the Ron DeSantis position, only 29% say that makes them more likely to vote for a candidate overall, whereas 57% say it's more than a majority, say it makes them less likely to vote for that candidate. With the Republicans, there is a clear majority, 52%, in favor of, and say that is more likely to make them vote for a candidate who supports banning abortion after the first 6 weeks, and only 30% opposed. Now, 52% is not like 80%, but you can see how the politics of this within the Republican base, especially because the pro-life part of the Republican base is very organized and very effective and very powerful, you can see why you have candidates like Mike Pence, Ron DeSantis, and others who are getting really out of step with where the American people are on this issue. But, obviously within the context of a Republican primary, it makes some sense. But I have to say, overall, Emily, I wish that politics worked more like this, where you go through you have your personal issue priorities and you go through a list and how do these candidates match up to that list. But it's kind of precious to think that's how politics actually works.
No.
And you see it you honestly see it with Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump. Ron DeSantis' whole play was I am going to, on issues, I'm going to do all these issue-based things, policy things in Florida. I'm going to get to the right of Trump on issues like abortion and wokeness and transgender issue. I'm going to get to the right of Trump on all these different issues. It's where the base is. If I just look at the ideological charts and I look at the polling, this is where the base is. And if you ask voters in the Republican primary, they have seen that. They actually do say Ron DeSantis is more conservative than Donald Trump. They just still like Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Because it's more about the vibes and the energy and who's going to own the libs and who pisses people off. And it's much more about this sort of wholesome view of the situation versus let me go through an issue-by-issue checklist.
Yeah, no, it's always vibes. And I actually really like what Benji Starlin of Semaphore said when he tweeted this. He said, always love this NBC News poll where they test generic candidate, qualities and positions. Actual voting is much more complicated, but it's a great acid test for relative priorities and which issues are fully polarized on partisan lines or more niche. And you really do see that with the border one. Whereas you see, for instance, with just to stop immigration or to deal with immigration, sending the military to the border, it's 46-40 with allowing kindergarten teachers through 8th grade teachers to discuss sexual orientation or gender identity. 46-46. Bans on trans adolescents taking puberty blocking medication. 41-44. Aid to Ukraine. 37-40. You see polarization down the line on actually most of these issues, even ones that I think the online right, capital O, capital R, thinks are just populist across the board, outright winners. Yeah, absolutely. That is not what this shows at all. Granted, that is more complicated. These are different questions than whether you support that, but this is asking whether it makes you more or less likely to vote for someone. And that the way that makes sense is it a priority for you?
Yes.
And what do you think of the people who tend to talk like this? I feel like that's actually a huge part of the formula when people are asked a question.
Yeah,
like that.
I'm always skeptical of these polls because I think people are bad, not because people are dumb, but because people are complex at assessing what their own motivations will be in terms of choosing a candidate. I wanted to ask you, Emily, what do you think of this one? So they asked this question, would you be more likely or less likely to support a candidate who, quote, threatens to penalize or financially harm businesses that make statements on LGBTQ and other issues that they do not agree with? This was a big loser. This was almost as bad as the Social Security and Medicare question. So the overall public, only 12% said that would make them more likely to support a candidate. And this is basically asking about the Ron DeSantis Disney situation, right?
Yeah.
And 70% said it would make them less likely to support that candidate. Even with Republicans, this was a dog. This was the second to the worst polled question. 16% said it would make them more likely, and 58% said it would make them less likely. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think to apply that to DeSantis, which you're right, I think they're clearly trying to do, is not super helpful because that's such a specific situation. And Disney occupies such a unique and distinct place in a public's idea. So there's something more emotional and specific about the Disney example. But I do think this gets to what we're talking about in that it's about the vibe. So when you're asked this question as a member of the public, you're thinking, what the candidates I can think of that are talking like this are the ones that just don't these are the hardcore Republicans, and most of the country is not hardcore Republican.
Right.
So if you're coming to associate these types of policy positions with hardcore Republicans, especially in the middle of a primary, and as Republicans have been gearing up for a primary for the last couple of years, that's an interesting sign to the GOP to say, hey, the marketing on these issues, when maybe if you ask them in a different way with more specific examples, you'd get different results. But that just means the marketing, the sort of 30,000-foot level association that the public has with this piece of our agenda, not great.
I also think, in fairness, I think this wording is very loaded. Threatens to penalize or financially harm business. I think the language is a little bit loaded.
Agreed.
And is part of what is driving this result. But It is interesting to me that, this is something that Trump has jumped all over DeSantis for.
Right.
He has really kind of taken Disney's side in this dispute and said that, they're humiliating DeSantis and making him look foolish, something like that along those lines. And, I do think that there is something there in terms of Trump feels like there's an angle that he can work. And, I think Trump is a much better politician, much savvier politician, and he has more of just a populist sensibility.
Yes.
Not that he's like a genuine, but he has that normie vibe sometimes that comes through. And in this instance, it seems to be backed up some by the polls.
Well, and let's move on to this. You can see there was one of the most hotly anticipated polls in politics, the Marquette University poll of Wisconsin voters. One came out yesterday on the GOP presidential primary. We can go ahead and pop this element up on the screen. It is B2. Yep, there it is. So this is Molly Beck of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. New polling in Wisconsin's presidential primary for Republicans from Marquette University Law. Trump is at 31%. DeSantis is at 30%. Pence at 6%, Tim Scott at 5%. That undecided number is around 20%. That's a pretty big deal, but I think it's
True.
Also that 20% is a really big deal. Now, the margin of error here for all voters is plus or minus about 4 points. Margin of error for Republicans about 6.5 points. So that Trump versus DeSantis could vary pretty wildly within that margin of error. And actually, that means Pence and Scott are both within the margin of error, polling at 6 and 5%. That said, it's going to be, we talked about this yesterday, that when you look at these big national polls of Trump versus DeSantis, of Republican voters, Trump is way ahead. But the way our primary process works, if you catch momentum in an early state, and Wisconsin isn't one of those, but if you could replicate these polling results at any point as we approach the actual primary or caucus in Iowa or in New Hampshire, because someone has a really good ground game in a state or is particularly popular in a given state, Wisconsin, somewhere that Ted Cruz actually won, I believe, in 2016, that was generally not a huge Trump state until he really started to catch on with folks in rural Wisconsin and is extremely popular up there. That is what can make the difference. If you start winning particular states, then you just get momentum in a way that totally changes the national polls. Again, I still think Donald Trump is clearly the front runner, but
right.
it's pretty, I think, useful to zoom in on particular states where the race is much closer, because that's an indication that DeSantis can compete in individual states, and individual states are going to be instrumental in shifting funds, in shifting momentum, and shifting media coverage as the primary season gears up.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty useful metric.
So that's definitely the DeSantis case, right? That's their case. That's their plan. Iowa has, I think he's got a decent shot there because there is a strong religious right, evangelical base that has rewarded candidates that do hold their issue set. DeSantis has positioned himself to the right of Trump, particularly on the issue of abortion. So I think that probably is his best shot. I spent a lot of time sort of downplaying, and I wouldn't say downplaying, but just my honest assessment is I think Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. But if I was to look at this poll and make the best case I can for DeSantis, I think it's very interesting that you have such a high number of undecided. Mm-hmm. And I think that's perhaps why this poll is such an outlier as opposed to all the other polls that come out that I'm looking at, Trump plus 34, Trump plus 24, et cetera, Trump plus 28, et cetera, et cetera. I think it may be because they allowed people to say they're undecided. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of other polls, the way they're constructed, you got to pick one. And so the best case I can make for DeSantis is that while Trump's base may look really rock solid, only maybe 30% of it is really rock solid. Maybe the other 20% that he typically gets, that gets him over 50% in these polls, maybe they are open. Maybe there is a pitch that you can make to them that would persuade them to move off of Donald Trump. And so, and the solidity of his support may be more of an illusion than it sometimes appears. I think that's probably the best case you can make for DeSantis based on this poll, which is admittedly an outlier based on the other things we've been seeing it coming out lately.
Yeah, and this is a poll that has been wrong in some pretty, I would say, egregious ways in the past.
They all have been, so in fairness. But this was one that was like really egregious in 2020?
In a couple different cycles.
Really?
They've had some misses. And with a plus or minus 6.5 margin of error for Republican voters, that's pretty significant. Now, if it's between Trump and DeSantis, this is Molly reading the poll here, 57% of Republicans say DeSantis, 41% say Trump. So DeSantis in Wisconsin, if this poll is to be believed, comes out ahead with Republicans pretty easily, like well above the margin of error if it's DeSantis versus Trump in Wisconsin. If it's Biden and DeSantis, 49% go with Biden, 47% pick DeSantis. Between Biden and Trump, 52-43. Biden wins over Trump by a larger margin than he ultimately did on Election Day. But that number, Trump versus DeSantis in Wisconsin, again, if this is genuinely an outlier and actually is picking up on something interesting that's outside of what we've seen so far and in a way that really reflects voter sentiment, that's quite interesting.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.